that we all can't be Americans and why. So obviously, if you listen to this, you might want to go back and watch part one because it'll give you more clarity as to what I'm talking about in part two. Now, why Pocahontas? Because she plays a central part in all of American history as we know it today. But I'm going to get into that later. We're going to talk about why Europeans even started calling themselves Americans and how that is so impactful in law. Now, reading the definition of American from Webster's Dictionary 1828 edition, American, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendant of Europeans born in America. Part one, I go more in depth and break down this definition further. But let's dissect the why of why descendants of Europeans are now deemed Americans. So the first thing that Europeans do when they colonize a place was dehumanize the people and misclassify them as something else. So in this case, Aboriginals to the American continents were often mislabeled as savages. And in doing so, it would always set the stage to justify the inhumane treatments that soon to follow. Another mislabel was Indians. And the fact that we widely still use the term Indians lets you know everything you need to know about indoctrination and how powerful it is. Because this ain't India, and it never was. So, getting back to Pocahontas, no matter what version of history that you read about this story, the consensus is that she is the sole reason why the European settlers survived in the first place. Now, as the story goes, she saved John Smith from getting his head smashed in. But she eventually married another Englishman named John Rolfe. And she ended up going back to England and having an heir, a son, with John Rolfe. And the story goes that when she was preparing to go back to her hometown or her home village, she fell ill and died before she could ever make the voyage back home. But she was survived by an heir. Keep that part in mind. Now, we're going to switch gears into biblical studies, particularly the story about Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau. Some of you know where I'm going with this, but for the ones who don't, I promise you, it's all going to come together. Now, as the pastor would say, get your Bibles out, turn to chapter 25 of Genesis, verse 21, because we're going to start there. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. And the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb. That's interesting. And 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So remember, 2 nations, 2 different manner of people. And as the story goes on, and you can read this in chapter 27, Rebekah helps Jacob to take or to trick Isaac into giving Jacob Esau's birthright, because Esau was the eldest and he was about to get the blessing from Isaac. So you got to read that story to completely understand how Jacob ended up with Esau's birthright or stole his birthright. And speaking on the point of birthright theft, this is why I made the correlations between Rebekah and Pocahontas. Why? Because there's a metaphysical comparison between the two. Now, here's where it gets more interesting. Pocahontas, when she was in England, was Christianized and baptized. And guess what name she took on? Rebekah. And this is her, supposedly, with that booty-ass chin, raccoon eyes. It says Mata Oka, which was Pocahontas' real name, als Rebekah. You can look this shit up. So let's recap. Pocahontas, who was a native woman of the Powhatan Confederacy, played a crucial role in the survival of the early English settlers. And with her allegedly saving John Smith and later on marrying John Rolfe, she became pivotal in establishing a fragile peace between the early European settlers and the Powhatan people. And her conversion to Christianity and adopting the name Rebekah symbolizes a deep cultural and spiritual shift. Because through her, the settlers not only survived, they gained a legitimacy over time. Because you got to remember, she had an heir. And in the Bible, Rebekah is instrumental to Jacob's future by helping him to deceive his father to give the birthright to Jacob instead of his older brother Esau. And this blessing/birthright transfer was more than just family inheritance. It was the transfer of a spiritual authority and the continuation of a divine covenant. But the line of descendancy was artificially taken over through this deception. Rebekah's actions ensured that Jacob and not Esau would carry on the Abrahamic lineage, thus shaping the future for the Israelite people. And here's the metaphysical connection. Both women in their respective narratives are pivotal in the transfer of power and identity. Pocahontas, who aligned herself with the English settlers, unknowingly or unwittingly became a bridge that facilitated the takeover of the Americas by the Europeans. Her personal transformation and Christianization into Rebekah symbolizes not only a personal shift, but a metaphysical shift as well. And because of this metaphysical shift, the indigenous identity was subsumed under the new emerging American identity, which was dominated by European culture and Christianity. Likewise, Rebekah's role in the Bible can be seen as a metaphysical act of transformation. And how? By ensuring that Jacob received Esau's blessing, she set in motion a series of events that would define the spiritual and national identity of Israel. So those two stories are centered around and pertains to birthright theft. So that's why the Europeans had to take over the name American for birthright theft purposes. Now let's get into the law aspect of everything. Escheat. In feudal law, escheat is an obstruction of the course of descent. And so that obstruction can be like how Jacob received Esau's birthright artificially. In consequent determination of the tenure by some unforeseen contingency, in which case the land naturally results back by a kind of reversion to the original grantor or lord of the fee. In American law, escheat signify a reversion of property to the state in consequence of a want of any individual competent to inherit. The state is deemed to occupy the place and hold the rights of the feudal lord. Now, let's read the same definition from a banking dictionary. Wall Street Words. Escheat, the right of the state to claim a deceased person's property where there are no individuals legally qualified, and that's important to remember, legally qualified to inherit it or make a claim to it. This occurrence is fairly unusual even when the deceased leave no will. Now, how does escheat plays into all of this? This is why you got to learn what colonialism really is. If you take over people and you strip them of their name, their nationality, their culture, etc., they are now incapable of making a claim to their property because they're not in their true rightful status or state of mind. In law, it's called jus post limine, the right of post limine, the right or claim of a person who had been restored to the possession of a thing or to a former condition status, to be considered as though he had never been deprived of it. In international law, the right by which property taken by an enemy and recaptured or rescued from him by the fellow subjects or allies of the original owner is restored to the latter upon certain terms. And this is why nationality is so important. Nationality is of cardinal importance to every person because it is mainly through nationality that the individual comes within the scope of international law and has access to the political and economic rights and privileges conferred by modern states on their nationals. And this is why indigenous people all over the world were stripped of their nationality and told they came from somewhere else, and also why the Europeans take on the term of the original people. It's to escheat the land. So now they control the resources, the politics, and the education of the people they conquered. But here's how nationalization offsets that control. Nationalization is the alteration or termination of control or ownership of private property by the state. But again, if you're legally incompetent because you're not in your proper status, you are deemed a minor in law, which is why they call indigenous populations of people minorities or BIPOC. Black, indigenous, people of color. Sounds familiar? So let's go back to modern American law and we're going to read an international law. Jurisdictions over persons and nationality. Loss of nationality. Loss of nationality is brought about by voluntary expatriation or through the assumption of foreign citizenship. The original sovereign, however, in such cases retained the right to demand the fulfillment of any obligations towards it which had accrued at the time of expatriation. Such a claim can usually be enforced only if the person concerned again places himself within the jurisdictional area of his original sovereign. AKA, you have to nationalize and claim your true sovereign identity, your nationality. So this video explains why the word American is now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. So in part 1, I broke down how we're not all American. Part 2, I broke down why descendants of Europeans call themselves Americans today. And I gave you the metaphysics behind it. And I also gave you the real-time application in law and why it's used. Share this out. Let me know your thoughts. Peace. Americans don't